It isn't only in Britain that spring this year has taken everyone by surprise. Here, in the Ticino, on the borders of Switzerland and Italy, the slopes overlooking Lake Lugano have already burst into flower, at least a fortnight earlier than usual. But what, you may ask, has the early and welcome arrival of bees and blossom to do with food? Well, it's simply that the past winter, one of the mildest in living memory, has had its effect in other ways as well. Most important of all, it's resulted in an exceptionally heavy spaghetti crop. The last 2 weeks of March are an anxious time for the spaghetti farmer. There's always the chance of a late frost, which, while not entirely ruining the crop, generally impairs the flavor and makes it difficult for him to obtain top prices in world markets. But now these dangers are over, and the spaghetti harvest goes forward. Spaghetti cultivation here in Switzerland is not, of course, carried out on anything like the tremendous scale of the Italian industry. Many of you, I'm sure, will have seen pictures of the vast spaghetti plantations in the Po Valley. For the Swiss, however, it tends to be more of a family affair. Another reason why this may be a bumper year lies in the virtual disappearance of the spaghetti weevil, the tiny creature whose depredations have caused much concern in the past. After picking, the spaghetti is laid out to dry in the warm alpine sun. Many people are often puzzled by the fact that spaghetti is produced at such uniform length, but this is the result of many years of patient endeavor by plant breeders who've succeeded in producing the perfect spaghetti. And now, the harvest is marked by a traditional meal. Toasts to the new crop are drunk in these poccolinos, and then the waiters enter bearing the ceremonial dish. And it is, of course, spaghetti, picked earlier in the day, dried in the sun, and so brought fresh from garden to table at the very peak of condition. For those who love this dish, there's nothing like real homegrown spaghetti.
So that spaghetti tree hoax segment was broadcast on the BBC show Panorama, which I think is still around, on April 1st, 1957. It's still considered one of the very best April Fool's Day pranks ever pulled. Of course, to make a really good prank, you must make it believable. And so the idea came from this cameraman who was from Austria, and he remembered as a child that his teachers used to tease them by saying, "You're so stupid, if someone told you spaghetti grew on trees, you would believe it." And so the producer of the show heard this idea and he said, "Why not? I'll give you £100 to get the footage down." And then a famous war correspondent who was widely respected by the people and whose voice was instantly recognizable was recruited to do that voiceover. Apparently at the time, spaghetti was not a common dish. Mostly it came out of a tin, and it was quite exotic, and folks had no idea how it was made. And so the next day after this aired, there were many who called in to get more information on how to cultivate their own spaghetti tree. And were told to stick a string of spaghetti in a can of tomato sauce and hope for the best. So if you really want to fool someone, you have to go all in. And going all in was exactly what the early Christians did. Of course, they weren't really trying to fool anybody. They were spreading a message of a world that was transformed. A message of God breaking through, of this common criminal returning to life and turning everything they understood upside down. So it's no wonder that many of the people of the day thought they were being played for fools. This is not how things were. This was not what they'd been taught. This is not how life had been experienced. What made sense to the people of the time was that Jesus had been crucified and he died. The first witnesses to the resurrection knew this. In our gospel reading that you heard at the very first thing today, there's 3 women who go to the tomb. And they're greeted by this man who is in white, it says, and they're told, "Jesus isn't here. Why are you looking for him here? He's risen." And they were afraid of what that meant. The text says, on their way back to Peter and the disciples to tell them, they were trembling and in fear, and they didn't stop to say anything to anyone because they knew how it would sound. And so when Mary Magdalene told them of what the disciples of what they saw, the text says they didn't believe her. And when Jesus appeared to two of them on the road to Emmaus, and they came and told the disciples, guess what happened? Again, they didn't believe him. Second story. Still not believing, I'm no fool. And so it wasn't until Jesus appeared to them all and he sat with them as they ate together that they finally understood that God was not playing games with them. They were not being fooled. That Jesus was for real and now everything was different. In seeing Jesus again, they were given new life and they set out to change the world. Paul is the one who writes our reading today that Diane just read. He met Jesus on the road to Damascus. It was a kind of vision, a great light. And he heard this, Paul, why are you persecuting me? And though he hadn't known Jesus in his lifetime while he walked on the earth, Paul's life was transformed by that meeting as well. But he's well aware, like all the other believers, that this message of Christ risen seems to be some kind of a joke. Because the world in which Paul dwells is caught between these two types of wisdom. The Greeks had these great teachers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and great writers like Homer. According to John Meacham, who is a historian, to the Greeks, this idea that a man could be raised was preposterous. They had hero stories, and the goal of that story was the hero could endure in the midst of a tragic life. In the play Eumenides, Apollo remarks, once a man has died and the dust has soaked up his blood, there is no resurrection. What doesn't make sense to the Greeks is that a lowly peasant from Palestine who was crucified because he was stirring up trouble in a Roman province could possibly have anything to say about the purpose of humanity or the meaning of life or what the gods say about how we should treat each other. So Paul says that Greek wisdom cannot understand this resurrection story. And then he moves to the Jewish people and he says they were expecting a Messiah in the style of David, that great king. He was supposed to be a conquering king, a benevolent ruler, and the kingdom of God was going to come to earth when Rome was overthrown and evil was defeated. And then all the people would be resurrected together in what they call a general resurrection, and Israel would be restored. And so that's the kind of resurrection that the Jewish people were looking for. They did not believe there could be a personal, individual resurrection either. And so to the Jewish people, it was shameful that Jesus had been crucified and stripped of his legal rights. This is not how God is going to break through. And so to the Greeks and to the Jews, this story of Jesus raised, of God's reversal of fortune, of life coming from death, was foolishness. And those who believed it had been tricked and misled, and Christians were the original April Fools. So why was this message of Christ risen so powerful to those who believed? If you notice what Paul says, he says it's living out God's call. Living out God's call is how we understand God's power and deep wisdom. The awareness of this power of resurrection doesn't come from believing it happened, but in living out God's call. It's almost like you have to go all in before you can experience resurrection life. It's only then, when you're all in, that you understand that Jesus was raised, yes, but we are raised too. When we don't just believe in the resurrection, but we take a chance on living out God's call to resurrection living, God reminds us that the story is never finished with crucifixion. There is always resurrection. So let me tell you some stories of resurrection living. I was recently, actually Pam and I were recently at this conference called Why Christian in North Carolina. I told you about it maybe last week or the week before. And the most memorable thing was that the flowers were on the trees, and I miss it. It was a conference that's 2 days of stories from women who had every reason to lose their faith, every reason to abandon hope. But somehow they remain as followers of Jesus, and they're asked the question, why Christian? Why do you continue with resurrection living? And one speaker, her name was Donna Battle, was an African-American woman, and her father was a minister in a small southern town. Some of the children from her community were coming home from school, and they were playing around as children often do, and they were trespassing on a man's property on their way home from school. And he was furious that they wouldn't move away. They'd probably done this before, and so he took out his gun and he started shooting at them. He said he was shooting above them. Does this ring true? This sounds very much like our own story of Colton Boushey. But he hit some of them, and they were injured, and one of them was killed. And so the police in the town, they wanted to call it an accident. He didn't mean to do it. And Donna Battle's father stayed with them and convinced them that this man must be charged with a crime. And the African-American community held together on this loss of their children, and they came together. And eventually this man received what I think was a very light sentence, but for which the African-American community was thankful, because they'd expected, like so many times before, that this white man would be acquitted, like had happened so many times in their community. So when I heard this story, it reminded me so much of injustice that happens to people who are marginalized. It is such a tragic story, and it's really a kind of crucifixion, an event that could rob you of hope for humanity and of your belief in God. But Donna, the speaker, she had to ask herself how she could continue in faith when children are killed on the way home from school. She reminded us, sitting there, that there are so many crucifixions that happen every day. So many moments of despair and pain and sorrow. But her faith had taught her that Jesus resurrects every moment of death we encounter every day. She said this, "Come celebrate with me, because every day something has tried to kill me and failed." That is resurrection living. And then Pam and I were outside enjoying the sunshine and the trees and the warm weather. And a woman came up to us. I'll call her Shelley because I can't remember her name because I'm old. And Shelley approached us, and she asked Pam if the coffee she had bought there on campus was any good, because she said she was a coffee snob. Clear really quickly that she wasn't interested in coffee. She just needed some connection. Because Shelley is from Wichita, Kansas. And she was raised in a conservative Christian family, but Shelley is also gay and feeling very much alone in her place. So she'd come to this conference by herself. She told her mom it was a Christian conference, but it was a progressive Christian conference. And her mother says, "What does that mean?" She said she took a breath and goes, "Here it goes." She was just beginning to embrace the possibility that maybe her faith did not have to be small and judgmental. Maybe it was true that all were beautiful children of God, that gay folk and Muslims and immigrants and all other people that she was being taught to exclude might just be part of God's misfit family. And that's what she told her mother. And so she asked us where we were from and what we did, and she was really interested in Pam being the director of spiritual and family development here at the church. And she asked her, with a lot of pain and sadness, whether it was okay for gay people to work with children in our church. And we saw in her a crucifixion, kind of absence of joy and hope. And honestly, I don't know why, but I just wanted to hug her. And so she grabbed onto me, and we embraced for some time. And then she pulled away, and these are the words she said, and it really struck me. She said, "That was Jesus right there." Because narrow thinking and self-doubt and marginalization had almost defeated her. But Jesus had brought this tiny resurrection to her life there at that conference in a place so far from home where she came by herself and no one was there with her. "Thank you for being nice to me," she said to me later, as if expecting that a straight minister would dismiss her. And a hug was all it took for her to see Jesus and to experience resurrection. Here's my last story. On Friday mornings, we have a little drop-in coffee time, especially for those who are grieving or they're feeling overwhelmed or who just want to talk. And one of the women who comes was describing how much she missed her husband. Actually, all the women speak of how much they miss their spouses. She was saying how difficult it was to do things on her own, which they used to always do together. And so that coming Sunday was going to be the first time she would come to church by herself, because usually her family members came with her, but they weren't able to accompany her that day. And so she was determined that she could do it, that she could drive here and sit alone in the chairs that they once occupied side by side. And then a little resurrection moment happened in our group, and another one of the women who had also lost her husband said, "I will sit with you." She would move from her preferred spot so that they could give strength to each other. And I know you people who are here regularly know how difficult it is to give up your spot in church. All right? So I got to tell you, when Sunday came around and I looked down the aisle and I saw them sitting side by side, it brought tears to my eyes. How beautiful was that resurrection moment? That simple gesture of love, that display of hope, that though grief can encompass all and threaten to take you under, we can carry each other. We can bring resurrection to a crucifixion moment. I don't know what struggles you're experiencing in your life. You might be having a crucifixion moment with health issues of you or your spouse. You might be having problems with your children. Maybe depression has taken hold of you, or you're down to your last dollar. Maybe you're just tired of the grind and you really need to unplug. When I look around the world, I understand why it seems so foolish to continue in hope, to believe in resurrection, to live in the assurance that death does not win. But Easter reminds us that God's foolishness, God's yes to a marginalized Palestinian Jew who believed that love could break through and conquer the oppression of a Roman Empire, is beyond the wisdom of this world. It's laughable, really. Foolishness for sure. But until you don't just believe it, you live it. Until you experience love that is indiscriminate, that calls you as a beautiful child. Until you commit to a new way of living in love that endures and overcomes all the obstacles that have kept you down. until the kind gesture of a friend who knows right where you're at eases your burden and lightens your load. That is resurrection living. And we are April Fools. Thanks be to God. Amen.